The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the second day of this very interesting sesshin here at Mountain Gate. Most of it by Zoom, but not all of it. There's 4 of us here in this zendo. We are staying appropriately distant and wearing masks for chanting, and we're distancing also at the meals. So it's a new way of doing things, and also to have all of you tuning in through Zoom as well and joining us through this day. Welcome. I spoke this morning about Dharma Gates. This is one of the vows. This is one of the Bodhisattva vows that we take, actually. And what it means is that every single challenging moment in our life is an opportunity for increasing our freedom, for opening ourselves more to our innate compassion, our transcendental wisdom, to changing our behavior in ever more positive directions. It's an incredible thing, and it's essential in Zen practice. Because you have heard many, many times that although certainly in the early years of Zen in America, enlightenment or Kensho was seen as the gold ring to grab. In fact, many, many years ago, when Mitra-roshi went to Japan first for Zen training, I wouldn't say Japan first for Zen training. He went to Japan twice. Once was as a court reporter following the Second World War, and the second time he went to do actual physical Zen training, starting out with Nakagawa Soen-roshi, who was very kind and generous in introducing this middle-aged American to Zen practice, simply requesting that he only do an hour of Zen a day. He was not allowed in the Zendo, but he could choose anywhere else in the whole temple to do Zazen. And then in addition, Nakagawa Soen-roshi took him around with him when he would be entertained by his students and his friends. And he had a great number of very interesting artists, writers, and so on, friends. And this was right up Mitra-roshi's alley. And then 3 months into that really nice introduction, Nakagawa Soen-roshi took him up to Hoshinji. And I've just learned that the most recent abbot of Hoshinji, which was returned to strict Soto practice after Daiun Sogaku Harada-roshi died, has just died at the age of 93, Harada Sekkei. Harada is a very common last name in Japanese. And there, of course, initially on the train ride up, Mitra-roshi assumed that he'd be having tea with Harada-roshi, they'd be discussing poetry and so on and so forth. It was a rather rude awakening, because what he was aiming for on that train ride was the Rohatsu sesshin, which is the most strict sesshin of the year, very demanding. And in fact, Mitra-roshi, who was certainly not at all a flexible human being, actually fainted one night from the pain of trying to sit cross-legged. But when he went to Japan to train, he had in mind that he would grab Kensho and run. And that was the early sort of view of a lot of people in America when it came to Zen training. Go for the gold and you're home free. Well, I got news for you. That's just the beginning. but it's a wonderful beginning. And it offers so much potential. It's a major Dharma gate that has been moved through, and it leads up, by the way, to many further Dharma gates. And there are Dharma gates everywhere, particularly now. We have all kinds of things going on that are challenging our lives in the world, and in particular in America. The COVID virus incidence has suddenly burgeoned as people have been less restrained in their caretaking. And there are all kinds of other things going on. There's a massive, unusually massive airborne cloud of Saharan sand that is heading for the southern United States, and basically extremely limiting how far you can see, clouding over the skies, but on the bright side, making for spectacular sunsets and sunrises. At the same time, it's also creating a terrible level of air pollution. And we have the usual thing. Are we going to lose our job? We don't like staying home. It gets boring, and we begin to get restless. Cabin fever is abounding. And yet we have reservations about going out and about. There's a lot of rage happening right now. A lot of good positive change is in the air and beginning to unfold in many ways, and yet there's also the negative as well. And each thing that we are having to deal with, all the way from being frustrated because we can't get out and do the kinds of things that we would like to do and are accustomed to doing, to you name it, really. Friends, family members at risk, and even getting sick and dying. And I know that Rochester Zen Center had the first death of a Zen Center member. He happened to be part of the Cleveland group, had died quite a while ago at this point of the virus. And we've already had someone in our Sangha who's been sick with it and struggling to get back to complete health. There's a lot going on. But how to work with this? When things get difficult, painful, frustrating, anxiety producing, the only way really to work with it is not to try to think your way out of it. Years, decades of research into trauma healing has demonstrated that we cannot think our way through. It is a body-centered therapy. It's body-centered work. We have to embody that experience. Meaning, if we get anxious, we tune in and feel what anxiety feels like in our body. What is the energy of anxiety? We are, from early childhood, trained both overtly and covertly to shut down awareness of body. We don't know any other way to do it. We don't want to feel as bad as we feel. And it's clear that the adults in our life don't want us to be that way, acting out from those feelings. And so the only thing we can do, as far as we know, is to shut them down, to dissociate, to pretend they don't exist. But unfortunately, that sets up a serious negative trajectory. It works when we're in those circumstances and cannot be anywhere else. And until we grow stronger and bigger and more free in our ability to move around than the people that are in charge of us, then we're kind of stuck. But growing up past that point, moving out, going to school, college, getting jobs, and so on, we carry the same habit patterns with us because we don't know any different. And they don't work. And we wonder why our lives feel narrow and constrained. Why feelings come up and we don't know what to do with them except to feel awful. And to try not to feel that. Long experience in my life and studies as well by people who specialized in trying to relieve trauma show without a question that we have to embody whatever the energy is, whether it's anger, rage, frustration, anxiety, fear, terror even. It won't be until you allow yourself to truly feel that energy that you would call whatever you want to call it, and stay so present with it that it will dissolve. And it takes time and it takes practice. It's not an instant cure. But I can tell you that if you go for it, it will make an enormous difference in your life. And the thing is this, as I said this morning, when we are hamstrung, when we're stopped in our tracks, when we can't move in the directions we would like to move in, then if we allow ourselves to be totally present in our bodies, suddenly it comes to awareness, alternatives. There's a different way of seeing this, or there's a different way of going about whatever it is that we had thought we only had one way to do. It's amazing. And it's freeing. It's immensely freeing. It's not enlightenment, but it certainly allows us to move closer in that direction. I once talked with Toni Packer, who was she was set up originally to become the successor to Mitra-roshi and take over the Rochester Zen Center. She was a longtime Zen student of his. She was a psychotherapist. And she had come to Zen through Krishnamurti. She and her husband used to go to California and hear Krishnamurti and his teaching. And after Mitra-roshi set off on a year pilgrimage during which he was going to write a book. It was going to be a time away from the Rochester Zen Center, and Toni was taking over. And a bunch of us senior people moved out to Santa Fe, New Mexico to begin what would be Roshi's dream coming to fulfillment, which is to have a country retreat place where he would go into semi-retirement and just work with his senior students. That came to an abrupt halt through a couple of different means. One was that we were rebuffed again and then again and then again in Santa Fe in the environment, in terms of trying to get permission to build such a center. And then at the same time, Toni realized that she really didn't feel Buddhist. And the bylaws, the Rochester Zen Center required that the abbot be a Buddhist. She found herself so much more inclined in the direction of Krishnamurti. And there were other things that were going on at the same time at the center, which, by the way, have changed a lot. And so what happened was that Toni left and started the Springwater Center. She has since died at a ripe old age, into her 80s, and has a number of books about her way of working, which is about inquiry, which is very valid in Zen. and I would recommend reading them, actually. And so Mitra-roshi had to return to the Rochester Zen Center, and some of us stayed out in New Mexico, because if you've lived in the gloom and the Rochester area for very long, and you come out to the sunshine in New Mexico, you really don't want to go back. But there were changes, and with each of these changes, there was a positive change that came out of it. There usually is a trajectory of confrontation, in the sense that a direction we wanted to go in, or something we wanted to do, or a feeling we didn't want to have, suddenly appears. And then there's a struggle. But if we understand how to work with that struggle, we can turn it into an opportunity for increasing freedom and deepening practice. And again, in my own experience and in the teachings of those who have done trauma research, because it is, in a certain sense, a form of trauma, the only way in or out, whichever it is, I can never remember. Mitra-roshi used to always say the way out is the way in, or the way in is the way out, and I never could remember which was which. But anyway, I think you get the point. To become free, we have to go into our body to feel. It can make a big difference if we also, at the same time, journal, simply describe the sensations in your body. Handwriting, it can't be done any other way and have the same positive effect. You can type it on the computer and it doesn't have the same effect at all. But if you handwrite it, there's something about how the brain works, that the actual process of using your hand and writing down the words that describe what is going on in your body energetically bring you into such presence with that it can free you from whatever that feeling was that you didn't want to have anyway. This is extremely effective. I bring up again Jacques Lucidon in Buchenwald. He had a number of Dharma gates that he had to pass through, even from the age of 8, I think it was, when he was visiting his grandmother, which he did every summer. And he was out in the backyard in the garden and suddenly burst into tears, because at some level, he knew he would never see the garden again. And later that school year, the kids were racing out to recess, and he was being pushed from behind in the eagerness of the kids behind him to get out quickly too. He was wearing glasses at the time because his eyesight wasn't that great. And this was in the 1930s, I believe, before they had glasses that didn't shatter. And somebody inadvertently pushed him into the corner of the teacher's desk, and that was the end of his eyesight. How to deal with that? He went through a lot of stuff. He realized, interestingly enough, and this is something for all of us to take note of, that if he was in a snarky mind state, irritated, angry, upset, then he would bump into all the furniture around. If he was not, if he was clear and centered, then he could move around without any problem. And in fact, later on, as he got older and he was in high school, he and his buddies used to go hiking in the mountains. He could walk along a street and had a sense of, for example, there's a wall about 8 feet away from me, and it's about 6 feet tall. and there's a tree there, and so on and so forth. It's interesting that some time ago I saw a video of a blind man walking down a hallway in a hospital. He was being tested. He was blind. He literally could not see, and they had placed obstacles, cardboard boxes and different things scattered about in the hall, and he was able to move all the way down the hallway without bumping into any of it. Even though it meant moving around them, somehow he intuited that they were there. This is another thing to take note of, because we have more than one way of perceiving. And of course, sure, yeah, right, you can see, you can hear, you can touch, you can taste. But there's another sense that we can increasingly develop that is an intuitive sense. I hesitate to say intuitive, but that's the only description there is in the English language, at least. But there's a kind of knowing that goes beyond any intellectual knowing, that you just know, and it's valid, and it is accurate. Now, it takes a relatively clear mind to be able to discern. That knowing is always there for people. And that knowing is how we move into deeper understanding through our practice. It's why the emphasis on hara, the belly, the tanden, tantian, in different languages, is so upfront in Rinzai Zen, because Hakuin, who's the one that really popularized it, ran into a lot of problems when he was trying to go through Mu with his head, trying to think his way through Mu. And he managed to get a kensho out of it by the simple force of focusing on the question of Mu. I'm not even sure it was the question of Mu. I think it was just Mu, the word. And yet he found himself in quite a nervous state as a result, because he had worked from here up. And we are not just a mind, we're embodied. And in fact, our intellect is a small amount of our expression, of our way of being, of our living. And yet we're trained, particularly here in the West, we're trained to make it paramount. There are other countries that emphasize this as well. And in fact, I lived quite a bit in Southeast Asia and also in Europe. And the schooling there is basically intent on putting information in people's brains, and you just spit it out. You don't even question your teacher. You don't ask questions in class. It's considered an insult to the teacher if you ask a question. In that sense, our American education system is a bit better from my perspective, because it teaches us to think outside the box, hopefully, but it still emphasizes the intellect over a whole body way of perception, a whole body way of experiencing. And it hasn't been until the various recent wars that we've been involved in America that there's been enough trauma research that has discovered that, guess what? The body is actually an important player in this whole thing. And as the best-selling book of Bessel van der Kolk is titled, "The Body Keeps the Score." The body keeps the score. The way trauma happens It impacts the brain in such a way that we can't think our way out of it. It's too intense, and it just takes, basically it takes the prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, our intellectual capacity to figure out things and think them through, and it takes it offline. And they've shown this with MRIs. So if we can't think our way through it, the only way left is to go into our body where it's actually stored. It's locked in as energy in our body. And when we tune in to the energy of whatever mind state it is, whether it's one of well-being, whether it's one of anxiety, whether it's one of disgust, it doesn't matter what the mind state is. And there's a early Tibetan Buddhist teaching from centuries ago, more than a millennia ago, that speaks to this. And it's the same teaching that modern psychotherapy that does body work, such as Peter Levine, somatic experiencing, and other therapists who use similar techniques have discovered. It is that same thing of tuning in to the energy of whatever is being felt and staying present with that energy, resisting the urge to escape into thought or escape into some sort of doing something, reactivity, that opens the door to freedom from whatever that mind state is. And again, I have to emphasize that there's a definite learning curve on that. But once you get a hang of it, it is amazing how effective it is. And it clears the decks so that we can drop deeper in our practice. That's how to walk through a Dharma gate. Whatever is meeting us that is frustrating us is something that if we tune in to the sensations in our body that come up as a result and stay out of the story and stay out of the thoughts, and it can be, as I said earlier, effective, especially effective to journal. I found that out my own self, and it's made a big difference. And I would highly recommend it to anybody who's having difficulty tuning in. So I'd like to share a little bit more of Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche's father, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, the highly regarded Tibetan Dzogchen teacher. And again, Dzogchen is quite similar to Zen practice. In fact, the basic fundamental practices are quite similar. And they use breath practice and also awareness of sound. That's something else that we can use also in Zen. Awareness of body sensations. It's a harder one for many people. And I still favor the extended out breath. But, and I've said this before, it's very important not to use extending the out breath to block out feelings. That is not its purpose, and you will, you're not going to get where you need to get in a positive way using it in that way. It is when you extend that out breath, you are focusing on the physical experience of extending the out breath with a kind of a hitchhiker of questioning, not in words, but of an openness to possibility. At the same time, and this is kind of a strange combination, you think it is contradictory, but At the same time, there's an expanding awareness. So you're aware of the quality of the air. You're aware of sounds in the environment. You're aware of the temperature. At the same time, you're so deeply present with this experience of wordless inquiry that is done again and again and again. And it's amazing how it can bring us down to a very grounded place. And actually, technologically or physiologically, it activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and recuperate and all the other R's, except for resist. And it can make us feel quite grounded when we continue that practice. And it's an honest grounding. We find ourselves much more able to deal with adversity when we do that practice regularly. It also tends to open our mind. So it's incredible. And even if you are working on a koan, you let the koan questioning, wordless questioning, the yearning to understand, for example, what mu is, or to know that original face before your parents were born. You let that wordless yearning ride on the breath and take it far out. Reach through the breath. And you do it enough, and it'll make all the difference in our world. So again, this is from this book, As It Is, by Urgen Rinpoche. And here I'm going to share a little bit. Not recognizing in our own experience the unchanging quality of this Buddha nature, we entered into the encasement of a physical body of flesh and blood. Our speech became wrapped within the movement of breath to become voice and words. It appears and disappears. Consciousness began to hold a perceiver as separate from the perceived. In other words, it became a fixation on duality, a stop and start process that arises and ceases each moment. Arises and ceases each moment. We are not a fixed thing. Even this body is changing moment by moment, though it appears solid and permanent. Of course, we know now, particularly as emphasized with the coronavirus situation, that we're not necessarily anywhere near permanent, but we nonetheless assume that we are. It's especially if we're younger, we don't think that we're going to die. It's not something that normally comes to mind unless we have some scare that brings it up. To continue. Thoughts come continuously, one after the other, in an endless string. This endless string of thought has continued from beginningless time and just goes on and on. That's how the normal state of mind is. If we don't now recognize our own nature in this lifetime, we fail to capture our natural seat of unchanging, self-existing wakefulness. So in the midst of change, there is something that does not change, but we can't grab it. We can't hold on to it. It is indescribable. And yet there's some sense that we understand this. Instead, we chase after one perishing thought after the other, like chasing after each new bead on a string. This is how samsara becomes endless. While we are governed by this involvement in thought, we are truly helpless. But we don't have to be governed by it. That's where the practice comes in. Who can stop samsara for us? There's nobody but ourselves. Even if all the sentient beings of the 6 realms were lined up and you cried, please help me so I can stop being overpowered by my own thinking, even then, not a single one of them could help. How sad that we are controlled by this involvement in thought day and night, life after life. We could try to blow it up with a nuclear bomb to stop samsara, but it still wouldn't help. Nuclear bombs can destroy cities, even countries, but they cannot stop the mind from thinking. Unless we become free of conceptual thinking, there is absolutely no way to end samsara and truly awaken to enlightenment. Great peace is when the conceptual thinking subsides, calms down. Great peace is when the conceptual thinking subsides, calms down. There is a way for that to happen. Thoughts are actually an expression of the Buddha nature. They are expressions of our natural face. If we truly recognize Buddha nature, in that very same moment, any thought will vanish by itself, leaving no trace. This is what brings an end to samsara. But that doesn't mean that you end up thoughtless. It doesn't mean that you end up not being able to think. If we try to stop our thoughts, we could end up that way. I went down that road a little farther than I had planned to when my early years of Zen, because the instructions in Rochester were to stop our thoughts, to cut our thoughts. And so I thought, okay, and I got very good at cutting them off at the ankles. A thought would start to come up, boom, chop. And then one day, I began to realize that when I needed to think, I couldn't. So I had to back out of that one. Thought is a tool, and a very effective and a very helpful tool. But we use it as if it's the ultimate reality, and it isn't. Thoughts make stories. Thoughts allow communication, although not always effective and not only clear, not always compassionate communication. Depends on the motivation behind them and whether we're caught in that motivation or whether we're free from it. A little bit more. As I've often said, in this world, mind is the most important for the simple reason that it is mind that understands and experiences, not thoughts. It is mind that understands and experiences. When we allow ourselves to open to the energy that we are part of, to that flow of life, we find ourselves able to communicate wordlessly with all manner of beings, animate and theoretically inanimate, trees, animals, bugs. We don't normally think in this direction. We normally think of communication being words spoken to other people who speak words back. But that's an extremely limited aspect of communication. When you can be in communion with nature, and I think this is part of the benefit of what's called forest bathing in Japan, walking in the woods, just being in that greenery. Yes, it's been found that the trees apparently exude a chemical that is one that enhances well-being, that makes people feel at peace. But there's more to it than that. As I've often said, in this world, mind is the most important for the simple reason that it is mind that understands and experiences. And I think already I've gone on a fair length, so I won't any longer today. But today is being day 2, except that we're pretty far into day 2 now, and you all are pretty seasoned practitioners. Day 2 is often considered the most challenging day of a sesshin because the first day is dedicated simply to adjusting just physically and getting used to sitting longer hours and ramping up the practice. But then the shit begins to hit the fan on day 2. And there you go, lots of Dharma doors. So take heart. Out of great difficulty can arise phenomenal freedom. Thank you for listening. I'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.